Pulmonary compliance. So if we have to increase the volume to inhale, it means that compliance is going to matter. Remember that compliance is how much energy does it take to change the volume of a thing. Healthy lungs are very compliant. In other words, it takes a very small amount of pressure, pressure's on the X, volume's on the Y, right? So in a very compliant lung, a relatively small amount of pressure change, this is only 2 centimeters of water of pressure change, gets a very large 0.5 of a liter change of volume. So that's compliance. Remember my balloon analogy. An old stretched out balloon is highly compliant, right? A little tiny water balloon is very non-compliant, very much not compliant. So it takes a lot of energy to get a volume change in a very non-compliant lung. Okay, so highly compliant lungs, easy to expand. Why does that matter? It takes less energy to move the air we need to move, right? Ventilation, moving air in and out, ultimately is what the lungs need to do more than anything. So a compliant lung makes that easier. Okay, a non-compliant lung makes moving air harder, therefore it takes more energy, therefore it doesn't work as well. All right, so where does compliance come from? Well, we talked in pathology about how the architecture of the lungs do a number of things. You know, not only do they create the gas spaces, but that alveolar architecture also helps to support the air tubes in the lungs too. Well, that architecture of alveoli and air tubes together are what give the lung its compliance, right? You've got a lot of very thin-walled tissues that have a lot of elasticity, okay? So inherently it's compliant. We also add to that surfactant, okay? We'll talk about surfactant in a minute, but surfactant also works to increase compliance. So ultimately, where is compliance determined? About half of it is the chest wall, okay? And then about half of it is the lung parenchyma. In other words, you can have compliance issues from either side. You know how we talked about, there was even a test question on it, like kyphosis and restrictive lung disease? Okay, well, one of the problems with restrictive lung disease is this chest wall component, right? Okay, so that's pulmonary compliance. A piece of that is surfactant. And in order to understand this idea, you have to remember what the lungs are to the universe, so to speak, which is like a sponge, right? You've got a wet organ that has a bunch of little air pockets in it, all right? Now, that seems fine, except for the fact that water is resistant to air pockets. Remember surface tension and learning all about that from chemistry? Well, one way of looking at surface tension is it resists the creation of bubbles in a fluid, right? Particularly in water, because the bubbles tend to collapse. All right, so if we need to put air in our wet lungs, and lungs have this stickiness, or water has this stickiness to it, what's the solution? Surfactant. Surfactant dramatically lowers the surface tension of water and makes it much easier for bubbles to form. It's why we add soap to the bubble bath, right? Because it makes bubbles. It decreases the surface tension, and therefore the water can mix much more easily with the air that it passes through. All right, so in our lungs, we have soap makers. The soap makers are the type 2 pneumocytes, which I did talk briefly about in pathology. Where are they? Yeah, type 2 pneumocytes. They have a lot of membrane expansion, so they look sort of puffy in typical pictures. All right, so the type 2 pneumocytes make the surfactant. The surfactant, which is a phospholipid, okay, remember phospholipids from cell membranes, right? Well, the structure of the phospholipid is you have a hydrophilic side and a hydrophobic side. Almost all surfactants, that's a surfactant, a hydrophilic side and a hydrophobic side. So our surfactant in the lungs is a phospholipid. The most important one is this one, dipalmitoyl phosphatidylcholine, right? So that's the one that we make. And the graph shows you how it matters. Okay, so the first curve, these are lungs that are entirely filled with saline. In other words, there is no air, okay? Lungs that are filled with saline only, and we're not trying to put air in there, are very, very compliant, right? Because we are not trying to create bubbles in the fluid. All we're doing is moving the fluid, right? So saline water-filled lungs are very compliant. The problem, the reason that we need surfactant is because we can't live with water-filled lungs. We need our wet lungs to have air in them, right? So now you have this problem of you've got wet lungs, because we're wet inside, right? You've been in the anatomy lab, you know that, right? So you've got lungs that are wet, and then you have these tiny little air spaces. And surface tension wants to collapse those bubbles and make the bubbles disappear. So when we try to expand lungs that are filled with fluid and air, that's what this should say, is fluid and air. Okay, so in other words, air in fluid, because that's what lungs are. Then we see this big decrease in compliance. In other words, that it takes a great deal more pressure. We're a lot further down this way to get the same expansion, right? So this is volume, this is pressure. The saline-filled lungs get large with a tiny amount of pressure, right? The air-filled lungs, to get to the same size, need a great deal more pressure to do so. So all this is saying is that air-filled lungs without surfactant are not very compliant. All right, now, if there were a third chart, if we said air-filled lungs with surfactant, it would be somewhere in the middle, okay? So surfactant reduces the surface tension and increases the compliance. So air-filled are less compliant due to increased surface tension. I think I'm gonna move my the bit here. All right. So about a third of the compliance is the factors we talked about before, chest wall and architecture. 2/3 of the compliance, surface tension effects. See? So this is huge. Now, why does this matter? Why even talk about this if it's happening all the time? Because this is an area of pathology. In premature babies, one of the last things that develops in the fetus is surfactant production, which makes sense. When the baby is in the uterus, it doesn't need surfactant because its lungs are essentially saline filled, right? Now it's not saline, it's amniotic fluid, but you get the idea. So the baby doesn't need surfactant until it's ready to enter the air-filled world. So it means that babies who are less than 32 weeks can have an absence or at least a reduction in the amount of surfactant that they produce, which means their lungs are very stiff. So you have a little tiny baby with very stiff lungs. They're not strong enough to get the volume change that they need to get the ventilation that they need, right? So the way we fix this is kind of very simple. We take dipalmitoyl phosphatidylcholine, that one, and we put it in their lungs. So we intubate them, we put an ET tube down, and we take this white frothy stuff, and we put it down the ET tube. And you kind of lean the baby to the left, give them a little shake, lead the baby to the right, give them a little shake, and then you watch their compliance get better, right? So essentially as you're bagging them, right, so you put the white stuff down, and you bag, and first it's really hard because they're all stiff, and then after about the second or third, it gets real easy to bag them. It's very impressive, right? So adding a little compliance, adding a little surfactant dramatically increases the compliance. This surfactant is probably the single biggest reason why there are so many more healthy preemies today than there were 100 years ago, right? This is not new now, but it's 50 years old. It changed viability from 28 weeks down to 22 or 24. So it made a big difference. Now, the other place you see this, you can see it in grown-ups too, and that's in ARDS, Adult Respiratory Distress Syndrome. Remember we talked about that in pathology as kind of a death spiral, okay? There again, if you have had enough pulmonary damage that your type 2 pneumocytes don't work right anymore, then they stop producing surfactant and now your compliance gets worse. So now your already sick lungs are much harder to inflate, right? So you got a bigger problem. Third place we see this clinically is in drownings, right? So if you've had a lot of water wash through your lungs, your surfactant has been washed out. So you have very stiff and non-compliant lungs too, very difficult to bag, very difficult to ventilate. What do? Same thing we do with preemies, only quite a bit bigger volume. We put the surfactant back in, give them a little shake, one way or the other, and then the compliance gets better.